to think about and just to have it, which are really important things. And the main one with the biggest picture there is to look after yourself. So the Domestic Abuse Act training is not going to be like emotive and looking at videos and talking too much about victims, but I still think it's important to look after yourself. I think, you know, any kind of training that touches on abuse and a lot of other subjects as well, you know, it's like a living issue. And I think, you know, a lot of people are affected or know someone who's affected. So obviously look after yourself. If you feel you just want to break, do that. If, you know, afterwards, if you want to get in touch, my details will be on there. If you need any support or you want to ask anything or talk anything through, please do that. Really important to do that and have a break after the session. As I say, it's not as emotive as a lot of our topics that we train on, but it can still trigger things. Just a few things to point out. I will be sending the slides after this session. We aim to finish by 11, so you'll get a copy this afternoon of those slides, so you don't have to worry about taking too many notes unless there's anything extra you want to add to what I'm saying. The session is being recorded, so it's best if we keep our cameras off and on mute anyway because of the reception, because when everyone joins there will be quite a few of us, so keep them off anyway unless you're wanting to ask a question. So yeah, the session is recorded, just to let you know that. And we will have time to ask and answer questions. I think we'll leave that to the end because it's hard for me to see the chat box while I'm presenting as well. Okay, so just those few points to bear in mind. So what are we going to cover today? So we're going to look, like we do with all of our courses, all of our training sessions, at the prevalence of domestic abuse. A lot of you may have been on our training sessions before and seen some of these statistics, so there'll be no surprise. But some people might not be aware of the high prevalence of domestic abuse, not just in Wakefield, everywhere really. And then we'll look at a brief overview of the Act. So some of you may have been on one of the briefings when the Act first came into being in April last year. And if you did, you'll know quite a bit about the Act, but I'll give a little overview of the Act for those people who didn't attend those sessions. And then we'll be spending quite a lot of time looking at the key changes since the implementation of the Act. So what's happened since then, and you know, what have been the results. A lot of those are still coming through, but what changes have happened. Then we'll look at information on future changes because it's only just over a year since the Act came into being. So of course there will be future changes, things that haven't quite changed yet, or things that are having pilot tests, and then will be rolled out nationally when those are complete. And I think it's important to have a little look at an update on Wakefield's response to the Domestic Abuse Act, so you know what's happening right here in Wakefield and what's been done and what is still being doing and will be in the future. And as I say, we'll have questions and discussions at the end, but always remember, you know, if you think of something afterwards that you didn't ask at the time, at the end of the slides you will have my contact details, so you can always get in touch. So I hope that sounds okay for everyone. So if we look at the statistics now, so there are 2.3 million victims of domestic abuse a year, and age 16 to 74. We have to remember that although this is an offence that disproportionately does affect women, we do have men who are also victims of domestic abuse. So 2/3 of those, of that figure of the 2.3 million are women. But we must not forget, you know, sometimes we look at our statistics and it says it's mainly women, young women with young children, but we need to remember there are lots of other victims of domestic abuse, obviously male victims, but also older victims. There are people who fall above that age bracket there, people who are disabled, people from LGBT plus community, all sorts of people who we need to remember. So anyone can be a victim and anyone can be a perpetrator. So more than 1 in 10 of all offences recorded by the police are domestic abuse related. So that just shows the high prevalence. And remember that the police don't go out to every incident. This is quite a hidden form of abuse. So a lot of victims do not come forward for many reasons. And so the figure could be much higher. We need to bear in mind about children. It's estimated that 3 million children under the age of 17 live in a domestic abuse household. So that equates to like 1 in 5 children who either see or hear the abuse. So they may be in the same room, they may get involved in some way, they may even get hurt trying to defend the victim, or they may be in a different room, they may be in bed and they hear the abuse. And then we have to think of the children as well who may be out of their house when it happens, but they're coming back to the aftermath. So they're coming back to see the victim hurt, to see the house being smashed up, or it might just be the absolute really intense atmosphere when they come back to the house. The effect it has on children is really, really intense. There are so many children living in these households, many of them that we do not know about. They're not on our radar at all. Operation Encompass obviously alerts schools to incidences of domestic abuse in the previous 24 hours where the police have been called out. And that is great because the children, they get the support when they go into school, and then they're on the radar of the school so they can put safeguarding in place. But there are lots of incidents that do not get reported to police. So always remember, you know, like children, the ones that we know about through Operation Encompass or the police, that's good that we do know about, but there are many, many hidden victims there. So only 17% of victims or survivors whose partner abuses them do report it to the police. And, you know, we look at why that might be. And it's mainly because they may be scared to do so. They may have been threatened what will happen to them if they do go ahead and report it. They may also see some of the figures that I'm going to show you next about perpetrators being brought to justice and may think, I'm not going to go through it. A lot of victims do say that the court cases are more traumatic than the abuse itself, which is horrendous to hear and cannot be allowed to still happen. Also, you know, they're so dependent on the perpetrators. The perpetrator wants control. Control is at the centre of all domestic abuse, and they want the control of the victim. So what happens is that they become so dependent on the perpetrator, they lose touch with family and friends and feel that they've got no one to turn to. So they worry about what would happen to them if they reported it to the police. And some people don't even recognise that it's domestic abuse. Some people put up with it because they put up with it for so long. And some people just don't want to have that upheaval of moving house. Their children may be settled in a school. They don't want to uproot them from their friends. They may have lovely neighbours, and it's a big thing, you know, to move. And the most dangerous part of domestic abuse for the victim is at the point of separation. And a lot of victims will see things on the news where victims have been murdered or seriously injured at the point of separation or shortly after. So all that goes together, which is why it is only 17%. So in 2020 to 2021, only 8% of recorded domestic abuse crimes led to charges. And this is what I was saying about when we come to looking at these figures. So if only 8% of perpetrators are brought to justice, and, you know, you see this on the news, you see it on your news streams on your phones, you know, a lot of victims will know that and will think, well, what is the point? You know, and it's got worse because the year before it was 11%, so now only 8% are being brought to justice. We have to also say that the majority, like 55%, a big percentage of cases were closed because victims and survivors did not want to take any further action. And this is where they do not want to take their partner to courts. A lot of the victims do still love their partners, even though they are being abused. They're hoping that they might change. But also they just do not want to go through the trauma of going through a court case. So lots and lots of really horrendous figures there. So in April 2021, the Domestic Abuse Act became an act from originally being a bill. It's now in a statutory setting. And it was really welcome. It's a once in a lifetime kind of chance to change things for victims of domestic abuse. It took a long time to come. There were many years of consultations and lobbying But eventually, last April, just over a year ago, we got the Domestic Abuse Act. And this is because of all the horrendous figures I've just shown you. We need to be doing something to change those figures and to support victims so much more and to make the picture a lot better for their future. So we've now got a Domestic Abuse Commissioner. Nicole Jacobs is the first Domestic Abuse Commissioner we've had. She reports to Priti Patel, and she has got a really good background of working face to face with domestic abuse victims on the front line for many years. So she's a really good person to have in place there. And she has got many, many jobs to do, and she's really active. This act is not something that's just going to sit on a shelf and gather dust. This is a really intense one that a lot of people are getting extremely involved in. And the Commissioner's Office is very, very active in working with local authorities, running webinars, visiting different areas to make sure that they are raising the awareness and people are beginning to understand about the impact of domestic abuse on victims and their families. So the idea of the Act, it will strengthen the support for victims of abuse and their families by statutory agencies. So every authority has really got to up their game really in the support that they're giving to victims of domestic abuse. And one of the main things that the Commissioner's Office is looking at the effectiveness of the justice system. Victims need to be protected, need to feel that they can go to court and that they will get the outcome that they deserve. So bringing perpetrators to justice. One of the things that's changed already is in the past, a lot of domestic abuse cases kind of like timed out because it takes a long time for victims sometimes to come forward to report it. And they were running out of time before it was actually brought to trial. But now it's the time that's been changed. So it's 2 years from reporting, not 2 years from the incident. So in that way, we'll capture a lot more victims, hopefully. So if we look at some of the key changes, because obviously you can go onto the government website and download a copy of the Domestic Abuse Act. It's quite a thick document, as you can imagine. It's very, very wordy. But obviously, you do that, and have a little look at it. But what I want to try and do is to go through the key changes and how they may affect yourselves in your roles. So first of all, we have got a new definition of domestic abuse. There's always been definitions in the past and everyone's chose different ones to use, and the government did have one that we did use, but now it's been changed. And everyone around the country will be using the same definition. The main thing is that we do not call it domestic violence anymore. We must always refer to it as domestic abuse because domestic violence just makes people think of physical abuse, and domestic abuse is so much more than just physical abuse. So it's really, really important that we have this new definition. Also, children from the Act are now being classed as victims. And they certainly are victims. They used to be classed as bystanders or witnesses, but the impact, as I've already mentioned, on children is so high.
We will be testing the fire alarm today at 10 a.m. Fire alarm will start.
Sorry, I'll just wait while that's passed.
Please do not evacuate the building. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So at 10 o'clock, the alarm's going to be tested here in Wakefield 1. So hopefully it'll just be very brief, but I'll just pause when it goes off. That's not the best timing, is it? But there we go. These things happen. So yes, so children being classed as victims because of the major impact, both now and right into adulthood, both physically and psychologically, and they need to have that support. Obviously improved support for victims and their families, which we'll look at in a moment. And also there's a lot of legal measures. So a lot of different things now that are now being classed as offences that are, now included in the Domestic Abuse Act. When we're looking at perpetrators, and I think a lot of you here today will be thinking about, how there is a lack of work on perpetrator behaviour, and you are right. In the past, we have had funding to have a perpetrator worker, and as it happens, that funding then stopped. So that perpetrator worker is no longer with us. But both from the government and from Wakefield Council, perpetrator strategy is going to be a massive thing for this year and moving forward. So we're at the moment writing our new strategy for domestic and sexual abuse, and in there will be a perpetrator strategy of what we are going to be doing about perpetrators and working with perpetrators on behaviour change. And Nicole Jacobs at Central Government is also looking at kind of a nationwide perpetrator strategy as well, so that you will see a lot more coming through, because it is something that, you know, needs to happen. We can help victims and support victims, obviously, but until we start working with perpetrators more, I don't think we're going to see these figures coming down as much as we really want them to. So let's just look at the new definition of domestic abuse. So this is what you should be seeing everywhere now. You'll see it in all our training. And this is, if you ever need to use a definition, this is the one you need to use. And this is one of the major changes from the Act. And as I've said, and it says clearly here, it's not just about physical abuse. We must use the terms domestic abuse, not domestic violence. You'll still see it around, but as many places as we can, let's use domestic abuse as the terminology. So domestic abuse is domestic abuse if it's the behaviour of one person against another, and there has to be these three elements present. So A and B both have to be aged over 16. They have to be what we call personally connected, and we'll look at that in a moment, and the behaviour has to be abusive. So if these three things aren't present, it could still be abuse, of course, but it won't be domestic abuse. So personally connected, there are lots of different ways that someone can be personally connected. So if someone's married to someone, or in a civil partnership with someone, or if they have been in the past, even if they agreed to marry someone or agreed to enter a civil partnership, but then that agreement was terminated, those people are still classed as having a personal connection. So if they are or they have been in an intimate personal relationship with each other, so either now or in the past, classed as personally connected too. Also, if they have got shared responsibility over the same child, or they have in the past, and child here means anyone under the age of 18. And also if they're relatives. So some people think that it's got to be in the same household, living in the same house, but no, any relatives at all. So we do have a lot of abuse between like adult children and parents, adult children and grandparents, and also between siblings when they are adults as well. So any relatives are all classed as personally connected. So for instance, if there was abuse that was taking place with like a neighbour or someone you worked with, unless you were in a personal relationship with them, that is still abuse, but it wouldn't be domestic abuse. So remember, age over 16, personally connected, and the behaviour has to be abusive. So when we talk about children in the Act, so I've already said that children are now classed as victims, and they can be victims if they see, hear, or return to the house afterwards and experience the effects of the abuse. And they need to be related to one of the two parties. So it may be mum and stepdad or dad and stepmom, but as long as they're related to one of them, they are classed as victims. Now, because of this, there's been a lot more funding coming forward for children, because with the Act, we've got a lot of funding, each authority has, and we've been putting a lot of that towards supporting children. So we may come on to it in a little while, but we have now got 4 children and family workers within our Wakefield District Domestic Abuse Service, who, when the specialist domestic abuse practitioners go into the victim's home, when they see children are present, then the children's and family workers will work with those children to get them that support that they need. We need to have this early intervention with children so it doesn't affect them as much as it has been doing. So when we look at abusive behaviour, there are a few different forms. And I'm not going to go into each one of these in great detail, because obviously if you come on our domestic abuse awareness training or our coercive control, you'll have been through a lot of this already. But just to make a few points, I've already mentioned that at the centre of all of these forms of abuse, there will be control. And the behaviour can be a single incident, or it can be ongoing. It usually is ongoing, but it can just be a single one. And also domestic abuse is quite messy. It doesn't fit into clear little boxes. So victims will not usually undergo just one of these forms of abuse. Usually perpetrators are using a mixture of these, 2 or 3 at once, or, you know, quite a few of them. And there's an overlap between them as well. And just remember, you know, that physical, it's not just about somebody being hit or burned. It's about things like withholding food, handing out punishments, making people not have sleep, waking them up all the time. So things like that come under physical. Under sexual, apart from things like rape and sexual assault, which we all automatically think of, there's things like forced prostitution, denying safe sex, pornographic filmmaking against the victim's wish, and all things like that. Obviously, violent and threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, really controlling what the victim does, taking over their whole life and controlling them, and using threats to do that. Economic abuse used to be called financial abuse. So it's where people don't have any money. The victims have to ask for every penny that they want, or they may have a very small allowance. But it also includes things like not letting the victim claim benefits, not wanting them to have a job, because the perpetrator wants to have control over them. They do not want them earning their own living. They do not want them mixing with people and socialising, because they want complete control and want them to be dependent on them. And under psychological and emotional abuse, we have horrific things like gaslighting, which comes from the name from a drama many years ago, where the guy in the film just kept turning down the lights and dimming them, and the victim kept saying, "What's the matter with the lights?" And he would say, "There's nothing the matter with the lights, it's you." And she would think she was going crazy. And gaslighting is all about making the victim question their own sanity. So like blaming them and making them think that they're undergoing this abuse because it's their fault, it's something that they are doing. So lots and lots of different ones. And also under domestic abuse comes things like honour-based abuse, forced marriages, female genital mutilation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will be testing the fire alarm today at 10 a.m. The fire alarm will sound twice for a brief moment. Please do not evacuate the building. Thank you.
Okay, so lots and lots of different forms of abuse there. Just to mention the ones like honour-based abuse and forced marriages, that's usually when there's more than one perpetrator, not always, and it's more like people from the community or the family because they feel that the honour of their culture is being in danger and disregarded and disrespected. So let's get on to the Act itself. We've looked at the Domestic Abuse Act, which is a big part of it. We've talked about children now being classed as victims, which is 2 very good moves forward. And let's have a little look. And a lot of the measures are now in place. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner did say that within the year up to April 2022, most of the measures would be taking effect. And there's been a lot of movement there. There still are a couple of things that still need to come into effect, and we will look at those. So things that are already happening out there and have already come into effect. So the first one is the rough sex defence. So victims were getting harmed through rough sex, and perpetrators were using as a defence in court that it was just rough sex that went wrong. It wasn't intended, that the victim actually consented to it. But now there is a law that says with rough sex, no longer can it be used as a defence to claim that a person consented to serious harm for sexual gratification. So that sorts that out in quite a good way, that can no longer be used as a defence. Also, revenge porn, which is where people are forcing the victim to take part in pornographic filmmaking and photography, and then using it or threatening to use it, again, to control them. Now, it's always been an offence to use revenge porn, but now with the Act, it's been extended to cover threats. So any threats at all to do that, even if it's not carried out, it's just threatened, that is now a new offence. I think any second now the alarm's going to go off, so if I suddenly just pause, that's obviously why. We've got extraterritorial jurisdiction, so this is a new thing with the Act as well. So this applies to permanent or habitual residents of the UK, so people who usually live here but they may go back to another country at some point, but their usual residence is here. If an act is committed outside the UK, then it can be brought to trial within the UK as though it had happened there. So really good changes to kind of move forward and protect victims more. So already we're doing quite a lot to protect victims and also to bring perpetrators to justice in those new offences, which is really good to do that. So polygraph testing, this is like lie detector testing, and this is being trialled in the West Yorkshire area at the moment. So we will find more out about this. So it's a 3-year pilot of polygraph examinations on high risk and very high risk perpetrators of domestic abuse when they are released on licence. So right, okay, I'll carry on. Hopefully no more interruptions. So the 3-year pilot will gather lots and lots of evidence and lots of statistics so that it can be rolled out nationally if it's working really well. The idea is at the moment, but it might change obviously because of the pilots. So 3 months after release of high risk and very high risk domestic abuse perpetrators, they will be tested, and then every 6 months thereafter. But that is not set in stone, obviously, because it depends on the results of the first one. It will be more frequent depending on results. They cannot be used in court. The results of the polygraph doesn't mean that they can just be put straight back in custody. Sorry. They cannot just be put straight back in custody. But what it will do, it will help safeguard victims and their families. So polygraph testing is used for other offences, and it makes sure that probation and police know about the intentions of the perpetrator, and they will then be able to put in safeguarding measures, and have done in the past with other crimes, to keep victims and their families safe. However, although they can't be recalled back to custody, if the polygraph shows that they're going to be breaching their licence or things of that nature, then obviously probation will be aware of that. And if it shows that their risk has risen a level where it cannot be safely managed in the community, they will be recalled back to custody. So as I say, that is going to be taking place right now in West Yorkshire, and we will hear more about that. And the idea of these updates is every now and then we will do just brief online updates of the Domestic Abuse Act to update you on what's happened. So that will, the next one will probably include some more detail about polygraph testing. So other things that have taken place. So the government wanted homeless who were homeless due to domestic abuse to have priority need in local authority housing needs services. We've always had that in Wakefield, so that's something that we were doing well anyway and will continue to do. Obviously, the domestic definition of domestic abuse is now out there, emphasising domestic abuse and not just physical violence. And the onus has been put on local authorities to have new duties now to make sure that all victims of domestic abuse and their families have support in safe accommodation. Now, there's a lot of mention in the Act to this safe accommodation. And what that means is that the safe accommodation all over the country is like when it's single sex and it's self-contained, so they're not sharing any of the amenities. So that would be like the refuge, for instance, that we have, where people have accommodation and also lots of support. But of course, not everyone can go into the refuge. It's not suitable if someone's got, let's say, a teenage son, or there's only 8 rooms there, so not a lot of victims can go there. So there has to be other safe accommodation. So when victims are in crisis, say at 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning, you know, sometimes, a lot of the time actually, they have to be put in hotels and bed and breakfast, or they may be sleeping on a sofa in their friends' or family's accommodation. That is not safe accommodation. And we've said that housing needs service has as a priority to look after domestic abuse victims. One of their other priorities now is to get domestic abuse victims out of those unsafe accommodations and into safe accommodation as quickly as possible. So there are lots of different names. They call them like dispersed accommodation, move on accommodation, and all these different forms of accommodation. All the names of those are being given by central government. Some of those kinds of accommodation we have in Wakefield, some of them we haven't. But at the end of the day, safe accommodation, as I said, is single sex and self-contained to make sure that those people are safe. So also lots of special measures are coming in. So we've mentioned that the courts really need improving so that victims feel safer and feel that the perpetrator is being brought to justice. So special measures in courts, in family courts, in criminal courts, where victims can give video links from behind a screen. Some victims don't want to do that. Some victims do not want special measures and we have to follow their wishes, but quite a lot do. Also, something else that's been brought out with the Act is doctors can no longer charge domestic abuse victims for letters to support legal aid application, just trying to make the journey so much easier and smoother for victims. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner, although she's been around from April last year, her role's now been put on a statutory footing. That means that other government ministers and other public bodies have a duty to respond to her recommendations. So she can hold to account as well Wakefield Council if we are not doing what we should be doing by the victims. So if they feel that we are not supporting them in the way we should or the way we said we would, they can bring any authority to account. Something which has bothered a lot of victims in the past is now being kind of brought to the attention of the Act. So secure tenancies, so domestic abuse victims who were previously lifetime social tenants worry that if they leave that accommodation, they'll have to start all over again, but they will be granted a new lifetime tenancy. Now, we've said about children being victims of domestic abuse already, and the support that they're going to get and the funding that's being put behind looking at extra support for children, which is definitely needed. So Clare's Law, some of you may know about Clare's Law, some of you may not. This is now on a statutory footing. It's been put on a statutory footing because it's been felt that in some areas, not necessarily Wakefield, but in some areas it's not being used as much as it should be being used. This is the right to ask or the right to know. So the right to ask is where a victim can ask about a new partner to see what their past history is and to see if they've got a violent past. The right to know is where the police alert domestic abuse victims of kind of new partners, current partners, and let them know if they have got a violent background. In the aim to kind of safeguard victims and stop the repeat offences. In Wakefield, we have a very high level of repeat incidents where people are going back into the same relationship or going back into another domestic abuse relationship. It's like 49% repeats, which we need to try and get down. And Clare's Law could help with this because, if the victims know that the person who they've now struck up a relationship with has got a violent background and has been a perpetrator of domestic abuse, they could be made aware of that and hopefully break up that relationship and not continue with it. With Clare's Law, the aim is to speed up disclosures. It's placing a bit of a duty on the police, with it being statutory now, to disclose information about new partners, ex-partners, violent offending. So what happens is the information is looked at by a multi-agency group to decide on what information should be told to the victim and what should be shared. And as well as that, online applications started in Wakefield in April last year, tying in with the Domestic Abuse Act. So special measures in civil court now. So those special measures have been extended to civil court. So things like having a separate entrance and things like that, so that the victim doesn't have to bump into the perpetrator or their families. There's now a prohibition of cross-examination in family and civil proceedings. So the perpetrator and the victim, cross-examination happening there, that is no longer allowed. We can imagine the trauma that puts the victim under. Also, one of the tactics of perpetrators is to keep dragging victims back to court and delaying them from moving on with their lives. So now we've got these barring orders in family court, so it stops abusive ex-partners bringing the victims back to court over and over again of the minor things. The victims are wanting to move on, obviously, with their life, and a lot of domestic abuse does continue after separation. So things like coercive and controlling behaviour does. They might use children to try and control things a little bit. And one of the things that they do as well, economic abuse continues after separation, like running up bills in the victim's name, doing anything to delay the sale of the house, all sorts of things so that the victim just cannot move on with their life. So the barring orders will help that. So controlling and coercive behaviour, as I've just mentioned, does happen post-separation. That is now going to be an offence. So if that continues after separation, that is an offence, as it is obviously during the relationship. The new offence of non-fatal strangulation, this became an offence just a couple of weeks ago. A lot of this happens in domestic abuse, not just in the rough sex side of things where people are being strangled, but in other ways as well. So perpetrators use this as a way of controlling victims, to get hold of, their throat and to try and strangle them, or to be forcing things into their mouth to affect their breathing ability. And it does affect 20,000 victims every year. That is now an offence. So even, it's non-fatal, but anything that affects anyone's ability to breathe is now classed as an offence. And it is so common, it's good that that has become an offence. So some of the things that haven't still happened but will be happening shortly. So domestic abuse protection notices and domestic abuse protection orders. So at the moment we have domestic violence notices and orders, and as you can imagine, we've changed that name to incorporate abuse rather than violence, as I said at the beginning. The reason they're not coming out yet is because lots of trials are going on, lots of pilots around the country, to make them really, really excellent, to make them so much more improved from the ones we've got at the moment. So at the moment, we'll still continue. It's not that we've been left without any notices or orders. We'll still continue using the domestic violence protection notice and orders, but these new ones will be coming out. So they actually start with piloting them early next year. And the pilot's going to run for approximately 2 years before being rolled out nationally in 2025. Now, that seems a long time off, and I always think that seems ages, but I think it's because so much work has got to be done on the new ones to make sure that they are fit for purpose and that they are used in the right way and used extensively. So with the notice, it's immediate protection for the victim following an incident. It's forcing the perpetrator to leave for 48 hours. So they've got 48 hours protection. And in that 48 hours, the domestic abuse protection order is applied for. So it will be applied for by a senior police officer. And then when it comes to the domestic abuse protection order, the new one, this will be a flexible duration. So at the moment, the protection order that we've got is just for 28 days, and then it has to be reapplied for. This one's going to be indefinite, so that's really good that once a victim's got the order, it's there. So it lasts a lot longer and it's better protection. And also, it's not just applications like from the police, there are alternative application routes. So victims can apply, and also third parties. Now, when this comes into being, we'll get a list of who those third parties are. So it might be support workers, social workers, GPs, but we will be getting a list of those. So the conditions of the new order will be that the perpetrator cannot come within a certain distance of the victim's home or work, of course. A requirement to attend behaviour change programmes, so perpetrator behaviour change, and possibly tagging as well. And the breach of the order will be a criminal offence. It will carry a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment or a fine, or possibly both. And the reason it's taking so long to put these into practice is because it's the government's intention that the domestic abuse protection orders will become this go-to protective order in cases of domestic abuse. The idea is that at the moment we use a lot of non-molestation orders and occupation orders, But the idea is that this will be the go-to order for domestic abuse, which is why it's got to really be fit for purpose and really effective and be able to be used by everyone. So non-molestation orders, the government's wanting that to be used for other abuse victims, not domestic abuse. But obviously this is all still being piloted, so nothing's completely definite and set in stone at the moment. So if we have a little look at what we've been doing in Wakefield, so we knew that the Act was coming, obviously, so a lot of work was done before the Act came into being. So every authority had to send down to the government by the end of October last year, either their strategy or, in our case, an addendum to our strategy, because our strategy is up for renewal right now in 2022. So we sent down like an addendum of the changes that we were going to make. And then the government looks at all of these from different areas, asks lots of questions, wants more information, and looks if they think that that is going to be the right thing to do by the victims. But this is where they can hold us to account if we don't do what we say we're going to be doing. So we will be having a new 3-year strategy, which is being worked on right now, and it will include, as I said, a review on perpetrator strategy in that strategy. So just before we go on to that, what we had to do at Wakefield was do a needs assessment. So we had an external consultant to come in and to have a little look at what we were doing at Wakefield as far as domestic abuse and victims and perpetrators is concerned. So it was a really massive report, and it went into all the different areas that touch domestic abuse, whether that's WADAS or ourselves or children's services, housing needs, voluntary sector. And they came up with a report of, you know, the things we were doing well, the things we needed to improve, and things that we really needed to start doing. And obviously with the Domestic Abuse Act, funding came along with that from the government. So we were able to start looking at what more we could do to improve the situation. I've just put these couple of comments in as well about things that are already happening as well. So West Yorkshire Police, really supportive of domestic abuse victims, I must say. And I think, you know, if you go, I sometimes recommend you going onto our website to have a look at things on the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's website. But if you go into the West Yorkshire Police one as well, you can see lots of things, what they are doing there. You can see the figures of Clare's Law, how many they've actually given out. You can look at things like this CARA, the Cautions and Relationship Abuse Programme, which is an intervention programme that's already running and has been running a while for perpetrators. And then we've also got this smart water and buddy tags to also help victims as well. So the smart water is where there's like a canister of kind of substance which kind of is specified for each person, you know, for each property. And if a perpetrator keeps coming around to the victim's house, if it's on the door, if it's sprayed on the door, or sometimes the victim has like leant out the window and sprayed it. And I was on a course once, and a police officer said she thought it had missed the perpetrator, but it had just caught his trainers. And so it could be tracked back that he was actually there when he said he wasn't. So again, it helps victims. And a lot of victims are saying that, you know, because they've got this now, they're not seeing the perpetrator either anymore or as much because they know they've got this initiative in place. And buddy tags as well is where the victim and the perpetrator wear tags, and the police can tell when those tags are getting close together so they can step in and support. So lots and lots of things and lots of actions are going off already to help with domestic abuse. So with the funding, what we got from the Domestic Abuse Act, we have been able to set on new roles, because the domestic abuse team, whether it's WADAS or the strategic team, was very small. And so what the needs assessment showed was that we do need more people, more roles to support the victims. So we now have a survivor liaison coordinator, Adele. She works with victims, including those with protected characteristics, trying to break down barriers, and she is setting up like support groups and things like this, because there's no better way of hearing what it's like for victims than directly from the victim. So she's doing a lot of work in that area. We've also just employed a domestic abuse engagement worker who again will be helping with victims and the liaison with them to support them. We have a domestic abuse and sexual abuse development officer that's looking at strategies and needs assessment, because even though we did this really lengthy needs assessment, we have to do a refresh every year. So right now we're working and just finalising the refresh about what we've done and what that has highlighted, because the areas we've improved have then like highlighted other areas that we now need to work on. So it's really ongoing, as you can imagine. My role was funded by the Domestic Abuse Act. We only ever had Anna, who did all the training for the whole of Wakefield. We've now only still got myself and Anna. It's still quite a lot of training just for two, but at least it's doubled. And we have a data and administration officer, support officer, because as you can imagine, we have to gather so much data, so much monitoring has to go on, and we have to send so much information down to the government. And, you know, for us to say, you know, what is the effect of all these things we're putting in place, you know, what is improving and what else we need to do. In Wakefield District Domestic Abuse Service, they already have the specialist domestic abuse practitioners, and they have new ones of those, extra ones. But now within WADAS, there's what we call the Safe Accommodation Team. And I mentioned the 4 children and family workers working specifically with children. But within that team now, they're based down at Queen's House. We have a senior domestic abuse and safe accommodation practitioner who is overseeing all of this. There are 2 housing specialist practitioners working with domestic abuse victims, a sanctuary worker, so sanctuaries where the house is made safer if the victim and their family want to remain in that house, if it's safe to do so, and if the perpetrator has left. So it's like organising things like change of locks and reinforcing doors, fire retardant, letterboxes, tags to the police so they know it's an urgent call if they get a call from that house. And also an abuse support worker. This is someone who's going to be working with victims with complex needs. So it might be reliance on drugs, it might be mental health issues, but someone, you know, people who have specific complex needs. So that's really extended the WADAS team. And it doesn't mean that, I mean, a lot of the Act says that victims and families will get support in safe accommodation. That doesn't mean that while the victims are not in safe accommodation, you know, those initial periods where they may be in hotels or in a friend's house sleeping on the sofa, the WADAS team, the SDAPs, the specialist domestic abuse practitioners, will support them wherever they are. It's just when they get into safe accommodation, it opens up a lot more support for them, which is why we need to have priority for domestic abuse victims to get out of these hotels and get into safe accommodation. So support for victims and their families. So this is the needs assessment, which we did, looking at the victims and their children, looking at areas of further development and how they can get that support. Really, really important. And with some of the funding, we have organised 4 pilot projects. These are all for referral through WADAS. So if you were working with a victim, unfortunately, at the moment, you can't just refer them straight in. It has to go through WADAS. So you'd refer them into WADAS and then they would refer them on. So we've commissioned 4 pilot projects supporting adults and children. So 2 are for children and 2 are for adults. The first one is counselling and therapeutic support for children and young people once they get into safe accommodation. And it's like a streamlined pathway for mental health assessment and for counselling support, because we know that sometimes people are on waiting lists for a very long time. So the pilot started in the 1st of November last year, and it's continuing until the 31st of October. Some of these pilots hopefully will be able to be extended depending on the results and everything that we get through from them. Project 2 again is for children. So it's looking at a recovery support for them, for children who've experienced or been exposed to domestic abuse, and also they may be exhibiting abusive behaviours towards their parent or carer. So this can happen. It doesn't always happen that it passes on, but it does happen. And so this project is to help with that. It's for early intervention with the aim of breaking this future cycle of abuse. and also looking at peer support opportunities for children, young people and their family there. And again, that's running for a year and hopefully will be extended because I think they're all doing very well. So the ones that are for adults is counselling and therapeutic support to adults. This has been delivered by the Well Women Centre and is doing really, really well. They will work with female and male victims of domestic abuse who are aged 18 and over in kind of like a therapeutic kind of support. Again, running for a year at the moment. But we can give you updates as we know as we go through them. So those three are referred through WADAS. The Pilots Project 4, which is a resettlement support, is delivered by Riverside. It's delivered through the Refuge. Again, this one's working extremely well. And it's like resettlement support. So when victims go into the Refuge and then they move on to independent living, you know, that can be really difficult to do that and adjust to that. So it's kind of supporting and having resettlement workers to support them with that, to look at the complex needs. So they're moving into safe dispersed accommodation, which means that it is safe, so it's single sex and it's self-contained, but also they get some support. It might be more floating support than what they had at the Refuge, but they will still get support. And it's helping them to like manage their own tenancy and to keep safe and to not go back into an abusive relationship. Also, the resettlement programme aims to maintain contact with victims who are on the waiting list, to offer signposting for them, so they've got some support while they're on that waiting list. And also it's looking at the residents. Obviously, the residents of the Refuge in Wakefield are usually people from out of area, and our high-risk victims go to out of areas as well. So the pathway into the resettlement support is for Marie House Refuge only. But like Riverside will keep in touch with out of area ones to capture that support that's happening there. So if we look at the update on training, so last year I trained 467 people on the Domestic Abuse Act, like the original one when it first came out. We, as I've said, we're running update sessions now. We're doing this one during safeguarding weeks. It's really important to update you about what has happened since April last year. They usually will be online because, as I say, they're not emotive like the other sessions we do. So we feel okay doing these online. A lot of our sessions we can't do online. So we'll keep having maybe 2 or 3 a year, maybe a little bit more depending on the changes, just so that you can, you know, join us and, you know, a brief session. Sometimes they might be shorter than this depending on what changes have happened, but just to keep you fully in the picture with what's happening with the Act and what's happening with Wakefield. So obviously we've gone back to face-to-face delivering of sessions now. So our domestic abuse awareness, our coercive control, which is called Why Don't They Just Leave, which is a question a lot of people ask. So, you know, please come on that if you do sometimes think that. And also the DASH risk assessment. Sometimes we do the DASH online as well, because I know a lot of people still do prefer online sessions, but we've been delivering all those and a lot of other sessions as well. So some of the other sessions that we have are sexual abuse awareness, FGM. We're starting one in August on CAPFA, which is child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse. That will be a face-to-face one as well. So you'll all have the July to December training opportunities brochure, but what I might do, I will attach to this training when I send it out, the brochure for you, so that if you want to come on any of those trainings, please do so. They are booking up very, very quickly. We've recently sent out information about LGBT plus victims of domestic abuse. That is completely booked up and booked up within, I'd say, 2 days. It was really in demand. We're having Gallup deliver that training because they are specialist trainers in that area, and I think that will be a lot more effective. We are hoping, if you couldn't get on that, to get some more funding so that we can do those sessions again. Gallup only want 30 people on each session, even though it's online, because I think they're doing a lot of interactive stuff. So we are going to try and repeat it. also a training session online about male victims of domestic abuse has just gone out, so you can come on that as well if you want to. We will soon be working already, can you believe, on the courses for January to June next year, so you will have that brochure when that's ready. I just want to have a little look now at some of the areas that have come to light since the Domestic Abuse Act has come into force. And if you go on the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's website, you'll see a lot of mention, a lot of reports and a lot of blogs and discussion about these areas. Because like with anything, when the Act came out, it was looking at supported victims in safe accommodation, it was looking at perpetrator work, it was looking at children, it was looking at the definition, and all those kind of things are now coming into place. I'm not saying the final, you know, a lot of work still needs to be done on them, and things, as I said, we do some work and then it opens up another gate to some more work that needs doing. So it kind of is really an extensive piece of work. But some of the things that have come to light from the government as well as locally is it's really been highlighted that there's a huge lack of specialist support for LGBT plus victims. You know, with WADAS, you know, WADAS is available to everyone. It's open to everyone, whatever age, whatever gender, sexuality, whether people are disabled, all different cultures, everyone is supported by WADAS. But what we're finding is that people from different, what they call protected characteristics, do not realise that, you know. So we can put out a leaflet that we think is like gender neutral and everything like this, and says all victims, but some groups feel that unless it's specified that it's for males, for instance, then they don't think it is for them. And this is why we've like commissioned this training to Gallup for LGBT plus, because, you know, there's a huge lack of awareness out there. And I do think that, you know, victims want to be supported by people who fully understand their situation. I'm not saying that WADAS don't, of course they do an excellent job, but these are specialised areas. You know, we've commissioned the training out because, you know, we feel that it needs to be specialists doing that. It's also been highlighted that this tailored support needs to come from specialists in these by and for support services. So by and for services are, for instance, down towards London, there's like, and all over really, but just as an example, IMCON, our Southall Black Sisters, all these different kind of groups who are people from that community, if you like, or from that culture, who are delivering support for people and victims from that culture. So they have the specialist knowledge. They know so much about it. They're dealing with that every day, and they're tailoring their support for the different types of victims. Now in Wakefield, we do not have many by and for agencies and support services at all. So that's something that, you know, we need to be kind of like looking at, because it really needs to be by and for agencies that kind of like support in, you know, real great detail a lot of these victims. It is so effective. But don't forget that WADAS is open to everyone. You know, the statistics show that the majority of victims are women with young children, but there is so many victims that fall outside of that, and we cater for them all. But it doesn't take away that this specialist support from specialist services is absolutely brilliant and should be used a lot more. And the government's recognising this and putting more funding into these small by and for agencies around the country to help them to survive and to help them to support the victims from those specialist groups. It's still a big area that needs a lot of work. The family court response to domestic abuse. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner is well aware of that, and their team, you know, are talking to victims about their experiences through court. Lots and lots of case studies going backwards and forwards, and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner is determined to improve this response so that more victims feel safe and supported to come forward. The idea is this postcode lottery of domestic abuse services needs to end, and this is what the Act was brought out for, to make sure that it's a national response to domestic abuse, that everywhere is doing everything they can do, and everywhere is a quality service. So, you know, ending this postcode lottery, because it's the same with other areas, isn't it? We hear a lot about that, and it is with domestic abuse. A big area that's being looked at by the government at the moment is migrant victims and people with no recourse to public funds. This, unfortunately, wasn't included in the Domestic Abuse Act, but since in the last year, it's been brought to the attention that this is an area that really needs to be looked at, you know, where migrant victims cannot come forward to report it because they will be scared that they'll be deported on things of this nature. So that is a massive, massive area that's having a lot of government attention at the moment. I think we'll see changes there. The government are investing £75 million over the next 3 years to tackle perpetrators, which is excellent news, because that's what, you know, it needs to be done. We need to look at the perpetrator behaviour. We need to be putting things in place to support people with behaviour change, but also to be making sure that these perpetrators are brought to justice. So that is a really good amount of money over 3 years to tackle that. And there'll be other things as well. Every time you go on the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's website, there are other areas that have been brought to attention that needs more work being done on as well. So in March, just this last March 2022, the government issued a domestic abuse plan and also male victims position statement. And it was just, these are some of the highlights from it, just to show you what is being done, you know, to see that the Act is really working. So there's going to be over £230 million worth of funding for prevention, support of victims and pursuing perpetrators. And it's really highlighted in this statement that it's everyone's responsibility. So government, police, health, housing, education, business, you know, criminal justice service, everyone needing to work together to get this a better picture and to get those figures down and support victims more. £7.5 million is being given for effective intervention and training in healthcare settings. So like at Pinderfield Hospital, we have like an IDVA already in there, and that might be extended possibly, you know, we don't know, but, you know, having people there, because, you know, victims don't just come forward all the time to the police or to WADASH. You know, it might be the housing needs service. It might be if they go to hospital, in A&E and all places like that, where there needs to be, you know, a lot of training and like a lot of effective intervention there. 3.3 million is being spent on police training as well, because obviously there's a lot of changes with the Domestic Abuse Act. And there is a lot of funding for community-based support, 700 more specialist community-based support workers for survivors. So lots more IDVAs and ISVAs out there supporting victims. So these are things that are happening with that money. Just to go through some new initiatives that are happening. So the government have launched this #YouAreNotAlone website to give help and support for victims of domestic abuse. You may have seen in pubs and nightclubs, Ask for Angela. This is for victims, you know, people who don't feel safe. So they may be on a date and it's not going the way they wanted, or they just might feel that they're not in a safe situation, and they can ask for Angela to a member of staff. Those staff will have been trained and know what to do and to get support for that person. Also, Ask for Annie, so ANI, attention needed immediately. More and more companies are signing up for this, which is really good. It's kind of offering a safe space, and it's run by UK Says No More, and lots of banks, supermarkets like Morrison's, lots of pharmacists are able to kind of go to a member of staff again who've had extensive training to say that they need some help to do with domestic abuse. And then it's what the victims want to do and respecting what they want to do. So they may want to reach out to their family or friends to kind of like be able to speak to them in a private, safe space about what's happening to them, or they might want to be referred for specialist support. And the more places that sign up for this, the better, because it just opens that up to more victims. Also, a lot of financial sector firms are now signing up to the Financial Abuse Code, because economic abuse is very high prevalence. A lot of victims, as we've said, suffer this after the separation as well. So lots of financial companies signing up for that and training their staff. And we've also got DARA, which is Domestic Abuse Response Alliance. So this is 7 leading law firms who are offering pro bono legal advice to domestic abuse victims who can't get legal aid and can't afford private representation. And Safe Lives as well are also offering training to law firms free of charge. It was going to be just a pilot from somewhere down the Midlands way, but now it's been opened up to every law firm to give them a lot more specialist training on domestic abuse. So obviously we've got lots and lots of training sessions available, which I have mentioned, and I will send the brochure out to you. So, you know, please come on those if you can, and look out for new training sessions that will be forwarded to you. Sometimes if the new ones, we don't get them in the brochure in time, we'll just send a flyer out to everyone. They do book up quick, so, you know, do get on there. Sometimes we run waiting lists, so we really encourage people to let us know if they're not going to come, so that we can let other people have that opportunity. I will send out as well today, you may have got it if you've been on mine or Anna's training, but I'll just send it out anyway, an electronic copy of Domestic Abuse Support Services. This is a really good brochure which shows support for victims, support for children, support for perpetrators, both locally and nationally, with a bit of detail about the service and their contact details. So that's really good information to have, and we update it quite regular as well, so we can always send new ones out to you. As I've said, you know, you can visit the domestic abuse section on Wakefield Council website. Just get onto the website and in the search box, just put domestic abuse and now a page will come up. And on there, there's loads of information. It's updated regularly. There's also lots of videos as well that you can watch if you want to, about different forms of domestic abuse. And don't forget the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's website too. So I just want to say now, we have got an evaluation form that I am going to put into the chat box, which I'd really be grateful, because I know what I'm like. Once I've left the training, I'm not right good at then evaluating it. So we've still got a bit of time left before 11, which is great. So in a moment, I'll put that in the chat box, and it'd be really, really good if you could fill that in. It's not long at all. It just helps myself and also people who've organised Safeguarding Week to, you know, to look at what you felt about the course, what you felt about the booking arrangements and things like that. And it helps us to improve things as well for future sessions. But I'll come out of this as well, and we can see if there are any questions as well. Let's have a little look. There we go. Right, so have we got any questions at all that anybody wants to ask, or anything you want more information about, anything I've not covered that you'd like me to have? If not, of course, you can always, people often think of something afterwards and sometimes email me afterwards, so that's absolutely fine as well. So while you're just thinking about that, let me see if I can copy this link over, hopefully.
Karen,
there we go. Yes.
do we get a certificate for attending the course?
Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that as well. I will send you the slides and a certificate and the support sheets and the learning brochure. Yeah, you'll definitely get a certificate as well.
Hi,
So,
Karen.
yeah,
Sorry. I just wanted to ask a question about Claire's law, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I know you mentioned there'd been some changes, and I just wanted to clarify. So if you've got a high risk perpetrator that's maybe been sort of convicted in the past, should the police be proactively telling new partners of that person?
Yes, yes, that is, yeah, and now it has become statutory. That should be happening, yes.
Thank you.
So we've got the link there at the bottom. Can you see it in the chat? Wait a minute. Yes, if I click return, you might see it. So there's the form there, the evaluation form. Be really, really grateful if you could complete that and send it back. As I say, it's really, really short, but it's really, really, I'm really, really grateful if you could do that. Yeah, and we've just got there that it only takes 2 or 3 minutes. Yes, if you could do that, that's great. So any other questions? Anything else I can help you with? I hope, if not, to see you on future training, probably face to face. Probably quite a few of you have been on it as well already. But you know, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming along this morning. I hope it's been really useful for you. And as I say, any questions at all that come up, or any concerns you've had, you know, if you feel that something I've said like isn't happening, please get in touch, because we know we could do with hearing that information. I'm really grateful for any feedback at all. Okay, so if you can just complete the form, that'd be great. And then enjoy the rest of your day. I think it's going to be very hot, but I know in some areas it's forecast a thunderstorm, so just take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.